June 4th, 1942, 10:22 in the morning, somewhere over the central Pacific Ocean. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Raid McCluskey banked his dauntless dive bomber hard to the left and stared down at 33 aircraft following him in tight formation, and nothing else. No Japanese fleet, no carriers, nothing but empty blue ocean stretching in every direction to the horizon. He had been searching for 45 minutes. His fuel gauge was dropping. His orders said nothing about what to do if the enemy wasn't where they were supposed to be. Turn back to Enterprise and the battle was lost. Keep searching and his entire squadron might run out of fuel and ditch into the Pacific. He kept searching. What happened in the next 4 minutes would change the course of World War II. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, the same ships that had attacked Pearl Harbor, would cease to exist. The most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled would be destroyed not by superior numbers, not by better technology, but by a decision one man made when his orders ran out and he had to think for himself. This is the story of how America broke Japan's navy at Midway. And it starts not on a flight deck or a bridge, but in a basement in Pearl Harbor. By the spring of 1942, the Empire of Japan had achieved something no military force in modern history had accomplished in so short a time. In 6 months, Japanese forces had seized Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies. They had sunk 2 British battleships off the coast of Malaya, swept the Royal Navy from the Indian Ocean, and reduced the myth of Western colonial invincibility to rubble across all of Asia. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, had put 5 American battleships on the bottom of the harbor and crippled the Pacific Fleet. The fall of Singapore, which Winston Churchill called the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history, had shattered an empire's confidence. The Dutch surrender in the East Indies had handed Japan the oil fields it needed to fuel its war machine indefinitely. On paper, Japan had won. But one man understood with cold clarity that by the spring of 1942, the Empire of Japan had achieved something no military force in modern history had accomplished in so short a time. In 6 months, Japanese forces had seized Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies. They had sunk 2 British battleships off the coast of Malaya, swept the Royal Navy from the Indian Ocean, and reduced the myth of Western colonial invincibility to rubble across all of Asia. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, had put 5 American battleships on the bottom of the harbor and crippled the Pacific Fleet. The fall of Singapore, which Winston Churchill called the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history, had shattered an empire's confidence. The Dutch surrender in the East Indies had handed Japan the oil fields it needed to fuel its war machine indefinitely. On paper, Japan had won. But one man understood with cold clarity that it wasn't enough. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had planned Pearl Harbor. He had conceived of it, fought for it against a skeptical naval establishment, and executed it through the brilliant carrier admiral Chuichi Nagumo. He was perhaps the most capable naval strategist Japan possessed, and he had spent enough time in America, he had studied at Harvard, served as naval attaché in Washington, to understand something that most Japanese officers did not. America was not Britain. America was not the Netherlands. America was not a colonial power managing distant possessions on a constrained budget. America was an industrial civilization of continental scale, and right now, in early 1942, it was barely getting started. Before the war, Yamamoto had told Japan's Prime Minister directly, "I can run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year. After that, I can guarantee nothing." 6 months had passed. The shipyards of Newport News, Bethlehem, and Puget Sound were working around the clock. Aircraft plants in Buffalo, Long Island, and California were converting to war production at a rate Japan's planners had dismissed as impossible. Pilot training programs were being expanded by orders of magnitude. The Essex-class fleet carriers, far larger and more capable than anything currently in service, were already under construction. Every week that passed was a week Japan fell further behind. Yamamoto knew this. He had one window, narrowing fast, to destroy the American Pacific Fleet before it could be rebuilt into something unstoppable. He needed a decisive battle, and he chose the location carefully, a tiny coral atoll, barely 2 square miles in area, sitting 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Midway Atoll. If Japan seized Midway, it would push America's defensive perimeter back toward Hawaii, threatening the U.S. West Coast itself. The psychological blow would be enormous. But more importantly, and this was the heart of Yamamoto's logic, the Americans could not allow Midway to fall. They would have to come out and fight. And when they came out, Yamamoto would be waiting with the largest fleet Japan had ever assembled. 4 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, 11 battleships, 13 cruisers, and more destroyers and support vessels than most navies possessed in total. He called it Operation MI, and it should have worked. It should have worked if the Americans hadn't already read every word of it. Beneath the 14th Naval District headquarters in Pearl Harbor, there was a basement. It had no windows. It smelled of cigarette smoke, machine oil, and coffee that had been sitting on a hot plate for too long. The men who worked there rarely saw sunlight. Some of them hadn't slept in days. This basement was Station Hypo, and the man who ran it was one of the most unusual officers in the United States Navy. Commander Joseph Rochefort wore a bathrobe and carpet slippers to work. He had been known to go 72 hours without sleep, sustained by coffee and cigarettes and an almost pathological obsession with a single problem, cracking JN-25, the operational code of the Imperial Japanese Navy. JN-25 was an extraordinarily complex cipher system. It used a codebook of roughly 45,000 5-digit groups, each representing a word or phrase, and then encrypted those groups through a separate additive cipher that changed constantly. The mathematics alone were staggering. Breaking it required not just computational power, but something rarer, an intuitive understanding of how Japanese naval officers thought, wrote, and organized information. Rochefort had spent years immersed in Japanese language and culture. He wasn't just a cryptanalyst, he was a cultural interpreter, reading the enemy's intentions between the lines of incomplete, corrupted signal traffic. By May 1942, his team could read approximately 15% of intercepted Japanese naval messages. 15% fragments, partial sentences, puzzle pieces without a complete picture. But Rochefort had a gift for reconstruction. He could look at a partial intercept, a date, a grid reference, a logistics request, the edge of an operational order, and infer the whole from the piece. He and his team had assembled a picture from these fragments. A massive Japanese operation was being planned. The target was designated in all messages as AF. The operation was enormous. The logistics traffic alone implied a fleet of unprecedented size. Multiple carrier groups, battleship squadrons, destroyer screens, troop transports. Whatever AF was, Japan was sending everything it had. The identity of AF was everything. Washington believed it might be the Aleutian Islands, Alaska, or even the American West Coast. Rochefort was certain it was Midway. The contextual clues in the message traffic pointed there consistently. But certainty without proof was not enough. He needed confirmation. What he did next was one of the most elegant intelligence operations of the war. Rochefort contacted the commanders at Midway and instructed them to send a plain language radio message, completely unencrypted, deliberately readable by anyone who was listening, reporting that their freshwater distillation plant had broken down. The atoll was experiencing a fresh water shortage. This was bait. If Japanese signals intelligence was intercepting American traffic, which Rochefort knew they were, they would report the water shortage to their fleet. And if the next Japanese message about AF mentioned a water problem, within 48 hours, a Japanese signals intercept arrived at Station Hypo. It reported that AF was experiencing a fresh water shortage and requested that the invasion fleet bring additional fresh water. The trap had worked perfectly. AF was Midway. There was no longer any doubt. Rochefort immediately briefed his superior, Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from this headquarters at Pearl Harbor. Nimitz was a man of deceptive stillness, calm in a way that conveyed not passivity, but absolute confidence. He listened to Rochefort's briefing, studied the intelligence assessment, and made a series of decisions that the rest of the world would debate for the next 80 years. He decided to fight. Not defensively, not by reinforcing Midway and hoping for the best. He was going to take his 3 remaining carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, and position them to ambush the Japanese fleet before it knew American carriers were anywhere in the area. The problem was Yorktown. Yorktown had been badly damaged at the Battle of Coral Sea 3 weeks earlier. A Japanese bomb had detonated deep in her hull, causing internal flooding and structural damage. Her engineers estimated she needed 90 days in dry dock before she could return to combat operations. Nimitz told them they had 72 hours. What followed was one of the greatest feats of emergency ship repair in naval history. Workers from Pearl Harbor Navy Yard swarmed over Yorktown around the clock in 3 shifts. They welded, patched, pumped, and improvised. They performed in 72 hours what normally took 3 months, driven by the understanding that every hour Yorktown sat in dry dock was an hour the Japanese fleet was steaming closer. By May 30th, Yorktown sailed with construction workers still aboard. They had to be evacuated by small boat once she cleared the harbor entrance. 3 carriers against what Japanese planning documents described as the most powerful naval force in history. Nimitz knew the numbers. He knew the risk. He also knew something Yamamoto did not: exactly where the Japanese fleet would be, when it would arrive, and in what formation it would approach. In the brutal calculus of war, that knowledge was worth more than a dozen battleships.
Operation MI was, by any measure, a masterpiece of naval planning. It was also, in ways that would only become clear in retrospect, a masterpiece of fatal overconfidence. Yamamoto's plan had 4 main components. First, a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, designed to draw American attention north and split whatever defensive forces Nimitz could assemble. Second, a carrier strike on Midway itself, bombing the island's defenses into submission. Third, an amphibious landing to seize and occupy the atoll. And fourth, the heart of the entire operation, the destruction of the American carrier fleet when it emerged to defend Midway. The plan assumed American carriers would be south of Midway, racing north from Pearl Harbor after the attack began, arriving too late to intervene in the initial strike, but presenting themselves for Yamamoto's battleships to destroy in a classic surface engagement. The American carriers were already there. They had been there for 2 days. But Yamamoto didn't know that. His reconnaissance was inadequate. A planned search by flying boats had been canceled because the refueling submarine was late, a small logistical failure that would have catastrophic consequences. His intelligence told him that American carriers were in the South Pacific, near the Solomon Islands. He was wrong, and he had no way of knowing he was wrong. The striking force, called the Kito Butai, was the most powerful carrier group the world had ever seen. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The same 4 ships, the same crews, the same air groups that had executed Pearl Harbor. Many of their pilots were veterans of China, of Malaya, of the Indian Ocean, of Coral Sea. They were the finest naval aviators on Earth, and they knew it. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the Kido Butai from his flagship Akagi. He was methodical, competent, cautious, qualities that had served him well in the unbroken string of victories since Pearl Harbor. On the morning of June 4, 1942, he had every reason to expect another. At 4:30 in the morning on a dark Pacific Ocean, Nagumo launched his first wave, 108 aircraft, dive bombers, torpedo planes, and Zero fighters, headed for Midway. The pilots flying south saw the first light of dawn appearing on the eastern horizon. What they didn't see were 3 American carriers sitting 200 miles to the northeast, their flight decks already active, already preparing aircraft, already waiting.
The first wave struck Midway at 6:34 in the morning. The results were mixed in ways that would prove fatal to Japanese planning. Midway's fighters scrambled to meet the attack and were massacred. The Marine Corps pilots flying obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and Grumman Wildcats were outnumbered and outclassed by the Japanese Zeros. 17 of 25 defending fighters were shot down in a matter of minutes. Survivors described the Zeros as appearing from nowhere, impossibly fast and agile, their cannon fire devastating the slower American planes before they could react. But the island itself survived. The runways were damaged but not destroyed. The fuel storage tanks, the critical infrastructure that would allow a counterattack, were untouched. The command structure remained intact. The anti-aircraft fire had been fierce enough to force the Japanese into releasing bombs at higher altitudes than planned, reducing accuracy. Nagumo's strike leader, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, circled over the smoking atoll and radioed back, "There is need for a second attack wave." This message arrived aboard Akagi at the precise worst moment. Nagumo had kept his second wave, 93 aircraft, armed and ready with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. Their purpose was specific: attack American carriers if they appeared. This was standard doctrine, the lesson of carrier warfare that every admiral had learned. Keep part of your striking force available for the naval threat while the first wave handles the land target. Then came a message from his search aircraft: no American ships in the area. Then came the attacks from Midway. American aircraft from the island, B-17 Flying Fortresses flying at high altitude, TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, ancient Vindicator dive bombers that had no business being in combat against the Japanese fleet, began attacking the Kido Butai in uncoordinated, desperate waves. They were slaughtered. The Zeros cut them apart with contemptuous efficiency. Not a single torpedo hit, not a single bomb found its mark. But they did something else. They created chaos. They forced the Japanese carriers to maneuver violently. They consumed the attention of the combat air patrol. And they consumed time, the one commodity that Nagumo was about to discover he could not afford to waste. At 7:15, Nagumo made his decision. He ordered the second wave to be rearmed, replaced the torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs with general-purpose bombs for a second strike on Midway. Rearming aircraft on a carrier flight deck is not a simple operation. It means bringing aircraft below to the hangar deck, removing one weapon and attaching another, refueling, and bringing the aircraft back up to the flight deck. During this process, the hangar deck fills with armed aircraft, exposed ordnance, and aviation fuel lines running everywhere. It is, in the clinical language of naval engineering, a significant fire risk. 30 minutes into this process, a search aircraft reported American ships. The initial report was frustratingly vague about what type. Then a follow-up arrived. One of the ships appeared to be a carrier. Nagumo stopped the rearming operation. He ordered his aircraft rearmed again, back to anti-ship configuration. The hangar decks of 4 Japanese carriers were now crowded with partially armed aircraft, torpedoes that had been removed and not yet restowed, bombs lying on deck, fuel hoses draped across the planking. The famous photograph that has been reproduced in 100 history books, the one showing Akagi's hangar deck crowded with aircraft and equipment, was taken approximately 2 hours before the ship ceased to exist. Nagumo also needed to recover his first wave, now returning from Midway, low on fuel. He needed time. He turned into the wind to recover aircraft and order his fleet to increase speed. In doing so, he created a window of approximately 30 minutes during which 4 Japanese carriers, carrying the fuel, the ordnance, and the crew of Japan's entire naval air power in the Central Pacific, were maximally vulnerable. Aircraft on deck, aircraft in the hangar, ordnance in the open, fuel hoses being transferred. No one on the Kido Butai knew that McCluskey was up there somewhere, searching.
The morning had been catastrophic for American aviation. 3 separate torpedo bomber squadrons had attacked the Japanese fleet and been destroyed. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, found the Kido Butai first. Waldron, who had an almost supernatural instinct for where the Japanese were, led his 15 TBD Devastators directly into the combat air patrol and anti-aircraft fire. All 15 aircraft were shot down. Of 30 pilots and aircrew, 1 man survived, Ensign George Gay, who floated in the water, clinging to a cushioned seat, watching the battle unfold above him. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise and Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown followed, attacking separately, with similar results. Of 41 torpedo bombers that attacked the Kido Butai that morning, 35 were shot down. Not a single torpedo found its mark. But something happened that no one had planned. The successive torpedo attacks, futile in terms of damage caused, had pulled every available Zero fighter down to sea level, chasing slow, low-flying aircraft at the outer edge of the fleet's defensive perimeter. The skies above the Japanese carriers, at 15,000 feet and above, were empty. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey had been in the air for 2 hours and 40 minutes. His fuel state was becoming critical. He had searched the area where the Japanese fleet was supposed to be and found nothing. His flight of 33 Dauntless SBD dive bombers from Enterprise flew in tight formation, the pilots scanning the ocean below in silence. Then McCluskey saw a wake, a single destroyer steaming at high speed along a course that angled northeast. He studied it for a moment. A destroyer moving that fast, on that bearing in this part of the ocean, was almost certainly racing to rejoin a fleet. He turned and followed it. The wake led him to the Kido Butai. McCluskey saw the 4 carriers below him, massive, their flight decks crowded with activity, visible from altitude as gray rectangles amid the blue ocean. He split his command instantly, half against Akagi, half against Kaga. Simultaneously, and by a coincidence of timing that bordered on the miraculous, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led 17 Dauntless dive bombers from Yorktown over the fleet at almost the same moment, aimed at Soryu. The 3 squadrons began their attack dives from 14,500 feet at 10:22 in the morning. Petty Officer Juzo Mori, a mechanic aboard Akagi, later described what happened. He was on the flight deck when he heard the anti-aircraft guns begin firing. He looked up and saw the American dive bombers coming nearly vertically, almost impossibly steep, growing rapidly from specks to recognizable shapes to the screaming silhouettes of aircraft releasing their bombs. The first bomb missed. The second hit Akagi's flight deck near the middle elevator and detonated. The explosion ignited the torpedo warheads and bomb loads of aircraft sitting on deck. The third bomb hit the rear of the flight deck and detonated in the hangar. The already catastrophic damage cascaded instantly as fire reached the fuel and ordnance below. Captain Taijiro Aoki, commanding Akagi, later said the ship became an inferno so quickly he could not account for what happened.
The fire spread below decks through the fuel lines, through the ordnance magazines that the rushed rearming had not properly secured, through every space where the accumulated chaos of the morning's back and forth had left material exposed. Kaga, nearby, was hit by 4 bombs in rapid succession. Ensign Takayashi Morinaga watched from Hiryu, some distance away, as Kaga erupted. He described it later, not a ship being damaged, but a ship being unmade, the flight deck peeling upward, secondary explosions from within throwing debris hundreds of feet into the air. Soryu's 3 bomb hits detonated her forward elevator and the aircraft massed near it. She was burning from end to end within minutes. 3 of Japan's 4 elite fleet carriers, the ships that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, that had swept British naval power from the Indian Ocean, that represented the accumulated training and experience of a decade of Japanese naval aviation, were mortally wounded in less than 4 minutes. McCluskey, pulling out of his dive above Akagi, looked back at what he had done, and later wrote simply, "It looked like the end of the world."
The 4th carrier, Hiryu, had not been in the target area when the American bombers struck. She had been operating slightly apart from the main group, and she survived the initial attack unscathed. Her commander, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, was arguably the most aggressive and capable officer in the Japanese Navy. Yamamoto himself had once identified Yamaguchi as his preferred successor, the man who might lead Japanese naval aviation into the next generation. Yamaguchi did not hesitate. Within the hour, he launched a counterattack. His dive bombers found Yorktown and hit her with 3 bombs. The damage was severe. Fires broke out. Speed dropped. The flight deck was torn open. What happened next was a testament to something unglamorous but decisive: American damage control. Yorktown's crew had been drilled to an extraordinary standard. They fought the fires with a ferocity that matched anything in the battle above, using every technique, every emergency procedure, every improvised method they could devise. Within an hour, the fires were under control. The flight deck was being patched. Yorktown was making 19 knots. When Yamaguchi launched his second strike, torpedo bombers this time, their pilots were briefed that Yorktown was listing, slowed, possibly sinking. Instead, they found her making good speed, her flight deck apparently repaired, looking to their eyes like a different, undamaged carrier. They attacked her as if she were a fresh target, putting 2 torpedoes into her hull. These hits were worse. The torpedo damage caused serious flooding and a dangerous list. Captain Elliot Buckmaster made the decision to abandon ship, fearing she would capsize. But Yorktown did not sink. She floated through the night, stubbornly refusing to go down, her hull too strong for the damage she had sustained. American destroyers would later take her under tow, attempting to save her. She would finally be sunk 2 days later by a Japanese submarine, but not before her aircraft had participated in the final stroke of the battle. Because American search planes found Hiryu at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. 24 dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and the still functional aircraft from Yorktown dove on the last Japanese carrier. 4 bombs struck her flight deck in rapid succession. The explosions below decks followed the same pattern that had destroyed her sisters: fire reaching fuel, fuel reaching ordnance, ordnance destroying the structure around it. Admiral Yamaguchi declined to leave his ship. He tied himself to the bridge railing and went down with Hiryu as she sank at dawn. One of the most capable flag officers Japan possessed, gone with his command, because there was nothing else for him to do. The Kido Butai had ceased to exist. Aboard the battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built, a floating fortress of 72,000 tons that had contributed nothing to the battle because battleships had nothing to contribute to carrier warfare, Admiral Yamamoto stood in silence as the reports came in. Akagi, sunk. Kaga, sunk. Soryu, sunk. Hiryu, sunk. 248 aircraft lost. over 3,000 men killed, and, the number that hit hardest, the number that could not be replaced by any industrial effort, more than 100 of the Kido Butai's experienced naval aviators dead. These were not simply losses of hardware. Japan's naval aviation had been built on a philosophy of extreme quality. Each carrier pilot had completed a training regimen of crushing selectivity and duration. The men who flew from Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had been flying combat missions since 1937. Some had more than 1,000 hours in their logbooks. They were irreplaceable. Yamamoto understood this with the immediate, cold clarity of a man who had warned his government about exactly this mathematics before the war began. He reportedly spent a long time in silence before issuing his orders for the fleet to withdraw. One of his staff officers, Commander Yasuji Watanabe, later recalled that the admiral's expression never changed. He simply looked at the reports, made his calculations, and understood what they meant. Not that Japan had lost a battle, that Japan had lost the war. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor airstrike and was aboard Akagi when she was hit, surviving her sinking, later wrote, "We felt the war had turned against us and we were going to lose." American losses at Midway: 307 men killed, 147 aircraft lost, 1 carrier sunk, all replaceable within months by the industrial machine Yamamoto had always feared. Japanese losses: 3,057 men killed, 248 aircraft lost, 4 fleet carriers sunk, 1 heavy cruiser sunk. The carriers could eventually be replaced, though it would take years. The pilots, the trained, experienced, irreplaceable naval aviators of the Kido Butai, could not be replaced at all. By 1944, Japanese carrier pilots were going into combat with fewer than 100 hours of flight time. American pilots arrived in the Pacific with a minimum of 400. The skill gap that Japanese naval aviation had spent a decade building was gone, and it would never return. Admiral Nimitz, in his assessment of the battle, wrote words that have been quoted in military academies and strategic studies programs ever since. Midway was essentially a victory of intelligence. He was right, but it was more than that. It was a victory of institutional trust, the trust that allowed Rochefort to operate unconventionally, to follow his instincts about AF when Washington disagreed, because Nimitz judged his man and backed his judgment. It was a victory of decentralized initiative, the trust that allowed McCluskey to search when his orders said nothing about searching, to follow a destroyer wake on instinct because American officers were trained to understand the purpose behind orders and achieve that purpose when circumstances changed. It was a victory of damage control, the unglamorous, uncinematic work of Yorktown's crew that kept her fighting long enough for her aircraft to participate in the destruction of Hiryu. And beneath all of these factors, it was a victory of industrial philosophy. Japan had built its strategy around a single decisive battle. Yamamoto's complex plan was designed to produce one moment of overwhelming destruction that would break American will. It was an elegant conception. America's approach was never elegant. It was attrition. It was the systematic destruction of enemy resources faster than they could be replaced, backed by production capacity so vast it could absorb losses that would have broken any other nation and keep building. When the bombers sank 4 Japanese carriers at Midway, they did not just destroy ships, they destroyed years of accumulated pilot training, experienced maintenance crews, practiced flight deck operations, institutional knowledge that took a decade to build. That knowledge could not be manufactured on an assembly line. Japan could build new carriers, it could not manufacture the men who knew how to use them. Former Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland, no stranger to watching a technically superior force be ground down by American production, once said that in a war of attrition, the side with the deeper industrial base always wins in the end. He was describing the air war over Germany, but he might as well have been describing the Pacific. At the United States Navy Memorial in Washington, there is a plaque commemorating the men of Torpedo Squadron 8, the 15 crews who flew into the Japanese fleet that morning and were shot down without scoring a single hit, their sacrifice pulling the Zeros down to sea level and clearing the sky above for McCluskey's dive bombers. The names on that plaque belong to men who did not survive to know what their deaths accomplished. They flew into what they could see, which was overwhelming opposition. They could not see what their attack enabled: the clear sky 4 minutes later, the bombs falling on crowded flight decks, the moment when the balance of the war shifted. Midway was decided by intelligence, by initiative, by institutional excellence, by the decision of one man to follow a destroyer's wake when his orders ran out, and by 30 young men who flew their torpedo bombers into certain death, and, by dying, changed everything. The thunder of those 4 minutes still echoes, because what happened over the Central Pacific on June 4, 1942, did not just decide a battle, it decided who would write the history of the 20th century. America's Pacific was born in 4 minutes of bombs falling on crowded flight decks, and Japan's, the one that had run wild for 6 months, that had seemed unstoppable, that had shocked the world, ended there. Yamamoto had guaranteed nothing after 6 months. He had been right.